The silence in the chapel was thick, broken only by soft sobs and the rustling of dress uniforms. Sunlight streamed through stained glass, casting fragmented colors on the polished oak casket where Staff Sergeant Elijah Callaway lay, still and solemn. His flag, precisely folded and sharp as military memory, rested atop him like a final command. At the entrance, a German shepherd named Orion stood tense, every muscle taut with suppressed energy. His dark eyes locked on the casket, unmoving. Margaret, seated near the front, felt the weight of what was about to happen. Orion surged. With one shattering lunge, nails scrambled against marble floor as he broke from his handler. Gasps echoed as he sprinted the aisle, leaping with the same precision that had saved soldiers in war zones. He landed inside the open casket, jarring the flag loose. Then, gently, he lay down, heavy body sprawled across Elijah's chest, as if trying to fuse with his fallen partner. Silence collapsed into a shared sob. Orion pressed his muzzle against Elijah's throat and released a sound that was not a whine, not quite a cry, but something ancient and wounded. Hardened soldiers turned away, unable to bear the rawness. This was not ceremony. This was grief. Margaret rose slowly. Her hand clutched the edge of the pew, her knees unsteady from the tremor of memory. She had stood with them both in Kandahar, had seen Elijah rescue the half-starved dog from the ruins of a bombed village. Orion had flinched at shadows back then. But Elijah had trained him, trusted him, fed him when protocol said to leave him. He called Orion his partner, his brother. Now the dog returned the honor, unbound by rules. She closed her eyes briefly, as if trying to slow time. A ripple of unease moved through the chapel, centered on Captain Wilson, whose expression hardened with each second Orion remained atop the casket. The chaplain's voice faltered. The ceremony had not accounted for love that disregarded orders, and yet no one moved to remove Orion. Not yet. The tension in the chapel was a wire stretched thin, and Margaret could feel every pair of eyes flick between the casket and the German shepherd, who refused to move. Orion's body had gone still now, his head laid flat against the wood, as if listening for Elijah's breath. A final duty, a final hope. Captain Wilson rose from his seat, his movements clipped and controlled. "Get that animal out of here," he hissed. "No." Margaret's voice rang out, clear, cracked with emotion. "Don't touch him." The captain froze. Even he could feel it, the sanctity of this moment. The chaplain, gentle and worn with years of grief, stepped forward. "Perhaps we can make an exception today," he said. He was staring not at Orion, but at the bond that blanketed the casket like armor. And so Orion stayed. A sentinel, a mourner, a soldier. The next morning, Elijah's home felt like a mausoleum. Margaret stood at the door, Orion's leash in hand, her breath held as if entering a sacred space. The ranch house looked the same. Nothing had moved since Elijah left it days ago, for what was supposed to be a routine appointment. But everything had changed. "Come on, boy," she whispered. Inside, Orion bolted forward, his claws scrabbling against hardwood. He searched the rooms, living, kitchen, bedroom, his nose pressed to furniture and walls. But there was no scent trail, no Elijah, only stillness. Finally, he stopped at Elijah's office chair. He sat, tail still, ears rigid, his eyes locked on the empty seat with a silent desperation. Margaret dropped to her knees beside him. Her fingers found his thick fur. "He's not here," she whispered, "and he's not coming back." A knock startled them both. Captain Wilson stood outside, dressed formally, posture stiff. "Sergeant Cooper," he said, ignoring the civilian space, ignoring Orion, who had moved between them like a shield. "It's just Margaret here," she replied, voice tired. They spoke of arrangements, and of Orion. "He can't attend the funeral," Wilson stated coldly. "Service animals are equipment. Reassignment begins after the grieving period." Margaret's coffee mug hit the table. The silence that followed said everything. "He's not equipment," she said. "He's family." The morning sky was heavy with the threat of rain, matching the mood inside Elijah's kitchen. Margaret moved robotically, filling a bowl for Orion, adjusting the black dress she would wear to say goodbye. The German shepherd hadn't touched his food in days. He lay curled in the corner, watching her with eyes that seemed to carry a century of sorrow. "You have to eat," she murmured, kneeling beside him. "I know. I'm not hungry either." The discussion with Captain Wilson had continued into the early hours. Sergeant Carter had tried to mediate, suggesting compromise. Orion could attend, but stay at the back with a handler. "That's not good enough," Margaret had said. Elijah would want him close, but the military didn't care about wishes. It cared about procedures. Reassign the dog, evaluate him, use him again. The system saw Orion as a tool, valuable, yes, but interchangeable. To Margaret, he was a promise. That memory clawed its way to the front of her mind now. Kandahar. The cellar. 48 hours of darkness and fear, hiding from insurgents while tending to a wounded teammate. There, in the flickering silence of almost death, she and Elijah had made their pact. If one of them didn't make it home, the other would honor what mattered most. Elijah's had been simple. Take care of Orion. He'd changed his paperwork. Listed Margaret as his sister. Legal fiction. Heartfelt truth. That bond, forged under fire, was more real than blood. "I want you to fight for him," Elijah had whispered. "They won't retire him. He's too useful. But he's done enough. He deserves peace," Margaret had promised, never imagining she'd need to keep that vow so soon. Now, at the chapel's entrance, she fastened Orion's formal service vest, the same insignia Elijah had worn. The German shepherd stood tall beside her, his posture rigid, his eyes shadowed with grief and discipline. As they entered, the room quieted. The honor guard stiffened. Mourners turned. They did not see a dog. They saw a soldier walking beside his fallen comrade. The chapel was full now. Rows of uniforms lined in solemn order. Polished boots, fixed to polished floors. Elijah's casket stood at the front like a final command post. As Margaret approached with Orion at her side, she felt the weight of every glance. Some nodded with respect. Others, Captain Wilson included, watched with clipped disapproval. "Sergeant Cooper, we agreed the dog would remain at the back," Wilson said, intercepting them. Before Margaret could answer, Sergeant Carter stepped in quietly. "I'll take him," he offered. His eyes met Margaret's. "You should be with the family." "Family?" The word lingered. She handed Carter the leash reluctantly. Orion's eyes followed her all the way to the front pew, his body taut as if fighting orders not to move. The procession began. 6 pallbearers, all from Elijah's unit, carried the casket down the aisle. Brotherhood in motion. The casket passed Orion, and something inside the dog shifted. His ears shot forward. A low whine curled in his throat. "Easy," Carter whispered, tightening the leash. But grief isn't governed by protocol. By the time the casket was laid at the altar, Orion was trembling. Margaret turned, heart clenching at the sight. His whines grew louder. He pulled against Carter's grip. The sounds he made weren't canine. They were human. Ache turned audible. Then it happened. The chaplain's prayer had barely begun when Orion barked once, loud, sharp, desperate. The leash slipped. 3 strides and he was airborne again, leaping with surgical precision onto Elijah's coffin. Uniforms stirred. Gasps rose. Time froze. Orion stood atop the casket. He scanned the room as if daring anyone to remove him. Then, slowly, he lay down, his head pressed to the flag, then nudging it aside until his ear rested against the wood. Listening. Remembering. Captain Wilson half rose. "Don't touch him," Margaret said, rising from the pew, her voice knifing through the tension. The chaplain placed a hand on Wilson's arm. "Let him stay," he said softly. "Let him say goodbye." The service continued with a stillness centered on Orion, who lay unmoving atop the casket. The chaplain's words floated through the chapel, curling gently around the living and the lost. Orion's breathing had slowed. Occasionally, his tail moved. Just a slight wag, hesitant, like an old soldier unsure whether the fight was truly over. Margaret couldn't take her eyes off him. He had always sensed things, before anyone else, before danger arrived, before Elijah spoke. Elijah used to say, Orion didn't just smell or hear the world. He understood it. Now, as the chaplain neared the end of his eulogy, Orion stirred. His ears perked. His chest lifted in a full inhale. Alertness snapped into his body like electricity through a wire. Everyone in uniform recognized the stance, Orion's working position. He had detected something, but there was nothing to detect. No enemy, no explosive, just memory and absence. Orion's gaze fixed on a spot near the casket. Something invisible. Something only he could see. His tail gave a single tentative wag. A hush swept through the room. "What's he doing?" someone whispered. "That's his alert," Sergeant Carter murmured. "It's what he does when he finds what he's looking for." Margaret's breath caught. For a long moment, Orion remained like that, frozen, reverent. Then, without cue or command, he relaxed. The tension left his body like water poured from a cup. He lay back down across the casket, his posture no longer tight with grief, but soft, surrendered. Captain Wilson shifted beside Margaret. "Dogs behave erratically under stress," he muttered, his words uncertain. Margaret didn't look at him. Nothing about their bond was ever normal. The casket would soon be closed. The flag would be folded. The ceremony would move toward finality. But for this moment, a soldier and his dog remained. Still, bound, unbroken. The honor guard moved with mechanical grace, their white gloves crisp against the deep walnut of Elijah's casket. As they lifted the flag to begin the ceremonial fold, Orion stirred beside Margaret. His body tensed again, but not in alarm, rather with the poise of understanding. He was watching. Every soldier present recognized it. The casket was being prepared for its final descent. The flag folded precisely, each crease a symbol. Life, honor, memory. When the commander turned to present the flag, Captain Wilson surprised everyone. "Include the dog," he said, his voice low but carrying. Gasps whispered across the pews. The honor guard adjusted. As the commander stepped forward, he addressed both Margaret and Orion. "On behalf of a grateful nation." The flag, once draped over Elijah's heart, was held between species, one grieving with language, the other with presence. Margaret lowered it so Orion could sniff it gently. It was ritual, yes, but also recognition. One last inhale, one last memory. Later, at the graveside, under a slate sky, Orion walked beside her with slow dignity. The rifle volley cracked 3 times across the silence, and though Orion flinched, he didn't retreat. When the final note of taps echoed across the cemetery, rain began to fall, not in sheets, but soft as breath. Then Orion stepped forward. The mourners stilled. With deliberate grace, he raised one paw and placed it atop the casket. The gesture was unmistakable. A salute. He held it for several heartbeats. Rain matting his fur. Eyes unreadable. Then he lowered the paw and took 3 steps back to Margaret's side. No command had been given. None was needed. The folded flag was placed in Margaret's arms once more. And in a break from all protocol, the officer turned and rendered a crisp salute, not to the casket, but to the dog. In that moment, even Captain Wilson did not object. He nodded, quiet and changed. The drive from the cemetery was swallowed in silence. Margaret sat with the folded flags on her lap, her thoughts drifting between memory and promise. Beside her, Orion rested his head on her leg, a steady weight grounding her in the now. Sergeant Carter drove, wordless but present, his hands gripping the wheel with quiet care. But outside, the sky was no longer just grieving. It was growing violent. Dark clouds churned over the Colorado mountains. Lightning fractured the horizon. Rain thickened, turning roads into black mirrors. Carter glanced at her. Forecast says flash floods for the canyons. We should pull off at the ranger station. Margaret nodded absently. But before they could reach safety, a sharp bark erupted from Orion. He lunged forward, body rigid, growling deep from his chest. Carter barely had time to react. Around the bend ahead, headlights cut through the rain. Too fast. Hydroplaning. A truck. Out of control. Carter swerved. The tires lost grip. Time fractured. The vehicle skidded sideways, sliding toward the embankment. They tipped, metal shrieking against mud and gravity, and crashed down toward the swollen creek below. The airbags exploded. Glass shattered. Silence. Margaret gasped for air, her ears ringing. Water seeped in. The vehicle tilted unnervingly. "Orion?" she called, disoriented. She turned. The back window was shattered. He was gone. She scrambled out with Carter's help, ignoring her own bruises. Rain pelted them like shrapnel as they climbed the slick bank. Flashlights cut through the storm. They called his name into the wind. Nothing answered. The other truck had vanished. Orion was out there, in the rain, possibly injured, afraid. And now the storm made the terrain a death trap. Rushing water carved paths through the earth, hungry and fast. Carter's voice cracked as he dialed emergency services. The words, "mandatory evacuation," rang in her ears. But Margaret refused to leave. Not without him. "He survived Kandahar," she whispered. "He can survive this." But as the rain poured and no bark came back, her hope began to fracture. They searched for an hour, Margaret and Carter stumbling along the flooded canyon road, flashlights trembling in their hands. Every shout of "Orion" was swallowed by the storm. Water churned over the asphalt. The creek roared with a voice like war, and still no sign. Then the patrol car arrived, its red and blue lights smeared by rain. The officer was young, soaked, and firm. "You need to evacuate. Now." "My dog is out there," Margaret protested. Her funeral clothes clung to her like regret. "Ma'am, it's a flash flood zone. That creek will swallow the road in less than an hour." "But he's not just a dog," she started. "I understand, but you need to survive too." It was the word animal control that broke her. Orion was a decorated war hero, not a lost pet. The irony pierced her like shrapnel. After all he'd endured, after surviving hell beside Elijah, it was a storm that might take him. And the day they'd finally won his retirement, no less. The day he was supposed to begin living free. She let Carter lead her to the cruiser. She didn't remember getting in. Only the blur of rain on the window as they drove away from the canyon and from him. That night in the shelter, Margaret sat wrapped in a Red Cross blanket, her fingers tight around the flags they'd managed to save from the crash. Her body was warm, her spirit frozen. She kept replaying Elijah's voice in her mind. Orion always finds his way home. That's his superpower. She hadn't believed it then, had thought it just affection, sentiment. But now, sitting among other evacuees under harsh gymnasium lights, she held on to those words like a prayer. Somewhere out there, in the dark and storm, a soldier's promise was still trying to find his way back. Dawn arrived in silence. The storm finally spent. What it left behind was ruin. Rivers where roads once lay, trees uprooted, and a canyon carved deeper by grief. Margaret had not slept. Her cot remained untouched. Instead, she sat near the shelter entrance, eyes fixed on the horizon, flags in her lap, hope thinning with every hour. Captain Wilson arrived in civilian clothes, the lines on his face deeper, softer. "I've called the K-9 unit," he said. "They're sending a specialized team when the road's clear." Margaret nodded, but it felt hollow. "He was supposed to be safe now," she whispered. "He was supposed to rest." Wilson said nothing for a moment. That dog survived worse, but she wasn't sure anymore. The night had been long, the silence longer. When they finally returned to Elijah's house, the sun lit everything in that eerie post-storm brightness. Mud streaked the gravel road, but the house, sturdy, elevated, stood untouched. The flag Elijah had raised weeks before still fluttered on its pole, a symbol of defiance against both nature and death. Inside, everything was as they had left it. Elijah's coat still on the chair, Orion's leash hanging by the door. She entered the study, drawn by something unnamed. On the desk lay papers for the foundation Elijah had dreamed of, veterans' canine companions. But something else caught her eye, a sealed envelope marked, "Open if necessary." Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal. Inside, Elijah's will, a transfer of ownership, a detailed foundation blueprint. The knock at the door jolted her out of her reverie. Margaret opened it to find Captain Wilson, flanked by 2 members of the K-9 training unit. Behind them, a military vehicle idled on the gravel drive. "Any sign?" she asked, hope flickering. Wilson shook his head. "Not yet, but they've brought tracking equipment. If he's out there—" A scratching sound cut through the air. Margaret froze. It came again, from the side of the house. A scraping shuffle, then a low, familiar whine. She ran, rounding the corner. Her heart slammed into her ribs. Limping slowly toward her, mud-caked and trembling, but unmistakably alive, was Orion. "Oh my God," she whispered. He reached her, pressing his body against her legs with a quiet sigh of recognition. His coat was soaked, his front paw lifted slightly, one ear torn. But his eyes, those deep, knowing eyes, were calm. He had found his way home. Wilson stood on the porch, speechless. "How?" he began, but stopped. The K-9 handlers moved in, checking vitals and injuries. "He needs a vet," one of them said. "But nothing life-threatening. Honestly, it's a miracle." Margaret knelt beside Orion, burying her face in his fur despite the muck. "Just like Elijah said," she whispered. "You came back." Wilson crouched beside them. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out a hand. Orion sniffed it, then allowed a gentle touch. "I've reviewed the paperwork," Wilson said quietly. "It's official. As of this morning, Orion is retired, transferred to you." He looked at Margaret, then added with a faint smile, "Elijah thought of everything." She nodded, emotion tightening her throat. "And the foundation?" Wilson asked. "We'll build it," she said, "for all the other Orions out there." The officer from the honor guard approached quietly. "If you're willing, we'd like to honor him. Present Orion with his own flag." Margaret's breath caught. Of course. They brought the flag, a tight triangle, mirror of Elijah's, and laid it at Orion's feet with full ceremonial words. Around them, salutes rose, not just to a soldier, but to the dog who had kept his post, who had survived the storm and found his way back to keep a promise alive. 1 month after the funeral, Margaret stood on the back porch of what was now her home. The air was crisp with early summer, the scent of pine hanging in the stillness. Below, Orion moved through the fenced yard with slow, deliberate curiosity. His limp was almost gone. His coat, once matted and rain-drenched, now gleamed in the sun. What remained, what would never quite heal, was quieter. The way he still paused at the back door every evening, as if waiting for someone who wouldn't return. Margaret understood. She had moved in after Elijah's will had been executed. He'd left the house to her, and with it, the responsibility of Orion's care. The foundation, too, veterans' canine companions, had become her new mission. Purpose in the wake of pain, a way to make good on a promise that stretched beyond one man's death. Inside, files and folders had multiplied. Grant forms, military correspondence, case studies. 3 dogs had already been matched with struggling veterans. Small victories, Elijah would have called them. Some nights, Orion still woke from dreams, panting, disoriented. Margaret would play Elijah's recording then, his voice calm and steady, grounding them both.